Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 96 of This Week in FCPA for the week ending March 30, 2018, the opening day edition. This Week in FCPA is sponsored by Affiliated Monitors. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides professional independent integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally and across almost all industries. With its knowledge of effective ethics and compliance programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitors is respected for its work as a corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even individuals. Having served in over 700 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance programs, visit Affiliated Monitors at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. In this episode, Jay and I take a look at some of the week's top ethics and compliance stories, including the Kinross Gold Corporation FCPA enforcement action, an article in the Wall Street Journal which asked, did Exxon structure a deal in Liberia to avoid FCPA liability? We take a look at Canada unveiling its version of Deferred Prosecution Agreements. I look back and reflect upon the Caremark decision over the past 20 years based upon an article by Donald Langevort in the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance. We talk about the risks of anti-corruption enforcement in China based upon an article by Eric Carlson in the FCPA Blog. Jay and I talk about our upcoming speeches, and Jay reviews the Affiliated Monitors presentations from the recently concluded SCCE European Compliance and Ethics Institute. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again with my good friend and colleague Jay Rosen for another episode of This Week in FCPA, episode 96 for the week ending March 30, 2018. The opening day is finally here edition. So, Jay, yesterday we had the opening day of baseball. The Houston Astros began their campaign for a wire-to-wire repeat of their world champions. Unfortunately, they were on the road up at Texas, the Texas Rangers, but they beat the Rangers, and they're coming home to Houston on Monday when we're going to unveil the first World Series banner to ever fly over the city of Houston. Other than that, is anything helping in the Rosen Ranch?
Well, I don't want to be a disgruntled chowderhead after one game already, but your former bench coach, Alex Cora, just got a first taste of what it's like playing for the Red Sox, and he was 6 outs away from his first managerial win. The Sox were up 4-0, and they ended up losing 6-4. So not that the season's over, but somebody remarked that when you play in Fenway Park, it's such a fishbowl, and the fans treat it like every game is the 7th game of the World Series. So some people respond to that pressure and thrive, and some people just can't sit in the kitchen. So we'll see, but I am not giving up hope yet.
So are you telling me that even after 3 World Series, you still have the lingering curse of Babe Ruth and still have low self-esteem and low self-respect around the Red Sox?
I'm not personally saying that, but I would think some folks may feel that way.
Well, at least you weren't out there trying to put a nail file on the ball in front of the world television audience to get a leg up, because I know no one in New England would do that.
No one would do that. No one would deflate their balls either.
There you go. Well, Jay, we had, I thought, kind of an interesting week in the ethics and compliance front, so why don't we perhaps jump right into it. We had an FCPA enforcement action to start the week with Kinross Gold Corporation, but it was an FCPA enforcement action where there was no evidence of bribery or corruption, It was the ubiquitous SEC accounting records provision, FCPA enforcement action, if that's not an acronym mouthful, where the company did not have proper internal controls and did not have accurately count on its books and records. They paid some $950,000 for fine and penalty for their lack of internal controls and books and records violations. But I found it interesting because I thought there were 4 key lessons. The first was Kinross purchased 2 mines. They're a mining company. One was the Tasist mine in Mauritania. The second was the Chinaro mine in Ghana. And the company had identified potential payment problems in the pre-acquisition process, but did not move to timely address the adequacy of internal accounting controls at the new business units after integration. There were some internal controls lessons because there was a real failure around internal controls at these mines, really not having meaningful internal controls around rebates, discounts, advance payments, government commissions, and unjustified business expenses. There were lessons for internal audit because the company's internal audit group was able to determine the internal control deficiencies both in an initial and a follow-up audit, yet they were not able to implement a set of present and functioning internal controls that were maintained. And then there were senior management lessons, which perhaps is the biggest lesson here, which is that senior management, although they did require internal controls to be remediated, they didn't stay on top of it to make sure that the internal controls were both present and functioning, or rather they were present, but they didn't make sure they were functioning. And then when there were 2 instances of potential red flags, management overrode internal controls in the sale of product and in the retention of an agent. So I thought some very good lessons learned, really because it was not a bribery case and focused directly on these 4 areas that I talked about, but particularly in internal controls. Anything that you were able to draw interesting, new, or different from the case?
I think you pretty much got it surrounded, Tom. My only question, which I didn't see addressed in the article, is did any of this really move up to the board level, or was the fact that management ignored the red flags kept this from getting up that high?
So we didn't see evidence in the SEC cease and desist order of board involvement. We did see specifically senior management taking a role, number one, in requiring that internal controls be remediated, but also on the negative flip side was the override of internal controls by senior management when it suited them.
Okay, so that would be my only question. On a little sidelight, I'm revisiting some ancient history, and I'm reading a book about Michael Eisner called the Michael Eisner and How He Lost the Keys to the Kingdom. And this pretty much looks at his career from starting at ABC and rising all the way up to running Walt Disney. And at one point, they were looking at the board's composition at the Walt Disney Company. And out of 16 board members, 12 of them were considered independent. And among the independent board members was Michael Eisner's lawyer, the school teacher for his kids. So one of the points they brought up was how could that board actually determine independently Michael Eisner's compensation. So I guess boards are on my mind, and that's why I diverted us for a second on that. Let me get us back into our next story. This comes to us from Sam Rubenfeld out of the Wall Street Journal. And Canada has announced a new method for its prosecutors to tackle corporate crime. There is a remediation agreement regime modeled on a tool that we know very well here in the U.S. and the UK, the dreaded or the celebrated Deferred Prosecution Agreement. And under the Canadian DPA, criminal charges are dropped after a period of time if an organization complies with the terms of the deal, Penalties typically would involve a fine and the imposition of a compliance monitor who reports to the government. The only issue that seems to be is that since this is so new in Canada, they don't actually have a reporting mechanism how to do this. And what happens is, one of our colleagues, John Boscariol, was quoted in the article, and it says, Canadian enforcement of its anti-bribery law has been quiet in the past few years following some activity earlier in the decade. And he said, this is in part because there wasn't a deferred prosecution regime to cover corporate misconduct. And here's the key part. There is no formal mechanism for companies to come forward voluntarily, disclose violations, agree to pay a fine, and then avoid conviction. Anytime a company comes forward, they risk a situation where there needs to be a penalty, and the only way to get that is through conviction. So I think right now the groundwork has been laid, but an actual path to getting a DPA and incentivizing a company needs to reveal itself over the coming days. Anything you take out of this article, Tom?
So, first of all, kudos to Canada for joining the modern day world's enforcement actions through deferred prosecution agreements. And I agree with John that there's no formal mechanism for companies to come forward voluntarily, and that this, anytime you don't have one, it's a risky situation. So this hopefully will move towards getting that in place and bring Canada into kind of the modern era of anti-corruption enforcement, giving the Canadian authority a full toolkit to police this area. I would note, Jay, that Kinross Gold Corporation is actually a Canadian company. They have some assets on the U.S. Or they're co-listed in the U.S. market, but they're a Canadian company, and they could well have been prosecuted or perhaps got a DPA. So interesting that Canada is finally joining the modern world of anti-corruption enforcement through the DPA process.
Bienvenue, Canada.
Yeah.
So the extractive industries and another Canadian company figure heavily in our next article. And this is how Tillerson's Exxon designed an oil deal to skirt anti-corruption scrutiny. What's this one about, Tom?
So can we just kind of state for the record that when your company is on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, albeit below the fold, with an article asking if it has engaged in bribery and corruption, it's not good, which is what we've awoke to this morning. Scott Patterson, Bradley Olson, and James Grimaldi did a excellent reporting job on a deal that Exxon did offshore Liberia. And there were initial concerns by Exxon about violating the FCPA because the owners of the rights to this offshore block were either unknown ultimate beneficial owners or known members or former members of the government. They owned a company called Pepper Coast Petroleum, and Pepper Coast Petroleum owned Block 13 oil rights. So Exxon did not want to pay for these oil rights directly to Pepper Coast Petroleum. So somehow a Canadian entity named Canadian Offshore Petroleum purchased the rights, 100% of the block rights from Pepper Coast Petroleum. And then they simultaneously turned around and sold 80% of those rights to Exxon. So Exxon had no direct contractual relationship with Pepper Coast Petroleum. Now, for those rights, Exxon paid the National Oil Company of Liberia $120 million. And then here's where some actions came in that may have been called into question. The National Oil Company of Liberia paid Pepper Coast Petroleum some $68.5 million of the $120 million. $45 million went to employees of the Liberia Finance Ministry as bonuses for doing work on this project. The National Oil Company of Liberia kept $5 million, and then they repaid a loan to EcoBank, a bank in Africa, which provided bridge loan funding. And this EcoBank made $1.5 million in fees. So we have a situation where Exxon is paying money to a state-owned enterprise, perfectly legal under the FCPA. Then monies from the National Oil Company are being distributed to individuals in the government, in the finance ministry, and a large amount is going to either Pepper Coast Petroleum or to repay a loan that the National Oil Company of Liberia took out to buy these rights or somehow pay Pepper Coast Petroleum. So lots of questions here. Jay, I'm sure you recall that the FCPA prohibits bribes or offers to bribe of anything of value to a foreign government official or an employee of a state-owned enterprise for the purposes of obtaining a benefit. It does not prohibit payment to a foreign government. So we've had several declinations where that issue came up, and companies got a pass. So in terms of FCPA, this really takes it a step further, because the article, which was based on documents provided to the Wall Street Journal by Global Witness and independent reporting by the Wall Street Journal, suggested that this Pepper Coast Petroleum was a front company for government officials from Liberia to line their pockets, and that the bypass mechanism was this Canadian Overseas Petroleum. Under the FCPA, I can't really say that, based on what I know now, that this structure was not legal, meaning illegal. We have Exxon paying the National Oil Company of Liberia. Now, we do have the National Oil Company of Liberia turning around immediately and paying money. But that, I don't think, is what the FCPA was designed to prohibit. And for the U.S. government now to prosecute a company under this fact pattern, Jay, I think would be taking FCPA enforcement in a new step that has not been taken before. So this is actually the type of structure, or close to the type of structure, which Shell and Eni, the Italian National Oil Company, have gotten into trouble around in Italy, or perhaps I should say the transaction where Shell and Eni paid the government of Nigeria, and then the government of Nigeria turned around and doled the money out, which may have been for bribes or may not. But that's a different type of anti-corruption issue than is typically faced under the FCPA, which is a direct payment or a direct offer or direct payment or offer of anything of value if it's not cash. So a really interesting fact pattern at this point, but like I said, based on what I know, I'm not seeing an FCPA violation. That does not mean this is right. It does not mean because you can do something that's legal and doesn't mean you should do it. And it does point to perhaps a larger problem in the extractive industries, particularly in other industries in Africa, which is the looting of the countries is not just taking money, which was due to the countries. The looting of the countries is by ceding the extractive minerals and rights to extract minerals to government officials who can then sell them later. So basically you have theft of natural resources from the country, and then those are being sold. That's a different problem than the FCPA was designed to remedy. And like I said, I think if the U.S. government prosecuted under this set of facts, it would be a more aggressive prosecution than we had seen in the past. But I have to get to the punchline, Jay. Okay. The punchline is when Exxon drilled the well, they got a dry hole. No extractive minerals were taken out by Exxon, and they lost the rights to this block. So much like the fellow driving the Hummer who took me out on a bicycle, who had no insurance, the punchline is Exxon didn't get anything out of this, except now they got a big old headache from being on the front page of the Wall Street Journal.
So the sub-headline here says, the big driller was excited about offshore prospects in West Africa, but worried about issues regarding U.S. anti-corruption laws. So if can a case be made if they decide that this design was intentional to have like a two-step transfer of the money? According to your read, that would still be kosher under the FCPA?
Well, right now, it's still legal to pay money to a foreign government. What the foreign government does after that is really up to the foreign government. We've never seen a enforcement action or a prosecution where a company was prosecuted for paying money directly to a foreign government. And that's really the defense of Shell and E&I in the Italian criminal prosecution. Their position is we paid the Nigerian government. What the Nigerian government did with the money after we paid them is not our business. It's not our concern. And further, it's not illegal. So it does open a potential can of worms, but it sure makes Exxon look like something was up.
Got it. So next we have an anniversary article from the Harvard Business Review, I believe, and it says Caremark and compliance, a 20-year look back. So what do you take out of this one, Tom?
So first of all, Jay, it's from the Harvard Law School, not business school, the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance and Financial Regulation. And it's an article posted by Donald Langevort, who is the Thomas Aquinas Reynolds Professor of Law at Georgetown Law School. And he took a look at a 20-year anniversary of Caremark, which is the seminal decision which stated that companies' boards of directors had to pay some attention to compliance. Now, it was a pretty de minimis paying attention to compliance. Nevertheless, it started the roller coaster for boards becoming more involved. And his law review article addressed three possibilities for greater board involvement than even is required under Caremark. First is the question of how much to invest in compliance. Caremark makes this a matter of business judgment, but subsequent securities law rulings have really expanded that. Second is reporting, how to deal with warning signs, when you should report to the board, when to escalate to the board. Once again, Caremark did not speak to this, but that's always a question of when do you get to the board, how do you get to the board, should you go to the board. And then thirdly was where I think we are now, Jay, which is it's not compliance policies and procedures. It's really a cultural turn, is what the author calls it, but it's the culture of compliance. So is the board setting a proper culture of compliance? That's obviously much more than tone at the top, but it's such things as properly incentivizing senior management to have compliance resources in place, making sure your company culture is more do the right thing than do the legal thing, and a wide variety of things simply beyond the technical aspects of a compliance program. So it was a very interesting article. It was a great review of the Caremark decision, what it meant then, and how the requirements on boards of directors have really evolved going forward, that I commend to anyone interested in this topic.
Great, and we've got that link to in the show notes, both the abstract and the full article. Next, our colleague Eric Carlson, who's one of the folks like Tom who writes for the FCPA blog, says that we can expect more anti-corruption enforcement in China. And there's some consolidation of different Chinese anti-corruption agencies that are happening. And there's going to be super enforcement agencies targeting government officials. Historically, the anti-corruption enforcement had been spread across multiple agencies, including the National Supervision Commission, the NSC, which was formally established this week, combines the functions of the CCDI, the Central Commission for Disciplinary Inspection, the Ministry of Supervision, the National Bureau of Corruption Prevention, and the General Administration of Anticorruption, all into one combined ministry. And basically, there's a lot of acronyms and a lot of different agencies. But what Eric seems to see is with this trade war that's heating up between the U.S. and China, that there could be definitely increased attention paid to certain U.S. companies who are offering in China. And it's, definitely going to be a time where if you have issues in your operations over there, it might be a good time for you to take a look at what you're doing and what can be done, especially because the Chinese government, I'm sure, would relish any opportunities to bring anti-corruption charges against any American companies operating there. Tom, did I do a pretty good job of doing the high level on that?
I think so, Jay, and I would just really reemphasize your last point, which is with this downturn in the U.S.-China relationships, Trump moving to what appears to be a trade war with China, that it certainly could mean more enforcement actions against U.S. companies. And in addition to everything you said U.S. companies need to do, it really drives home the point, Jay, that risk is not static, it's dynamic. And it's a wide variety of risks. This would probably fall under political risk or maybe economic risk, but it's certainly bleeding over into anti-corruption risk. And if your organization is doing business in China, your risk profile, I think, just shot up. And it's something that you need to be cognizant of. You're absolutely right, I absolutely agree with you that you need to take a thorough scrub of your Chinese operations. But remember, they operate on a very different legal system than we do. And so what may appear to be a clean operation from the United States perspective under the FCPA may be very different than in China. So there's Chinese domestic laws that come into play that you need to be cognizant of. And if there are any persons or third parties or entities that you've done business with in China that aren't squeaky clean, now would be a very good time to try and remedy that. And the last thing I would just say is if you have any questions, I'd just call Eric Carlson. He is a native Mandarin speaker. He's been practicing in China for, I think, at least 10 years and maybe longer. He's a great guy and works at Covington and Burling. So he's a smart guy and he knows his stuff. So if you're doing business over there, I think your risk really just jumped up. And as a compliance officer or chief compliance officer or compliance practitioner, you need to certainly be aware of your surroundings and have a dynamic risk modeling profile.
Awesome. So you've got another new podcast, Innovation and Compliance. Why don't you let us know what's happening there? And the handbook's coming out too. So what's the news on that front, Tom?
So, yes, we put up episode 2 this week on innovation and compliance. Had James Gellert, the CEO of Rapid Ratings, a company that takes a look at the financial health of third parties. It's continued to be a very successful podcast. If you're interested in innovation in compliance, this is the podcast for you. Next week, I have Ben Lachlan, who talks to us about the use of both big and small data. So it's going to be continue to be a cutting edge series. I've got some great podcasts in the can already that are lined up to go. So I hope you'll check that out. It's available on the FCPA Compliance Report, iTunes, Libsyn, YouTube, and on JD Supra. My book, The Complete Compliance Handbook, is still scheduled to be published at the end of April by Compliance Week. You can check out information on it on my website, www.fcpacompliancereport.com. If I could, Jay, I'd like to take a minute to talk about our colleague Jonathan Armstrong, who's coming to Houston, who on April 10th will be putting on a GDPR workshop hosted by the Greater Houston Business and Ethics Roundtable. If you need to know something about, if you do business in Europe, you better learn GDPR. And there's nobody better to teach you that than Jonathan Armstrong. If you're a lawyer, it looks like we'll have 3 hours of continuing legal education credit. So for $75, you certainly can't beat that. If you're a Gerber member, it's for free. And then I'm speaking later in April in 3 roundtables on behalf of Conversant. The first is April 4th in Miami. The second is April 17th in Houston and April 18th in Dallas. And Jay, I'm really excited because on those events, I'm going to talk about using data to drive ethics to the center of your business. So it's going to be a little more data focused, and I hope that I'll be able to tell a great story around the use of data in a best practices compliance program. From the affiliated monitors perspective, anything upcoming that you can tell us about?
I can give you a couple updates on the just completed SCCE ECEI, so the European Compliance and Ethics Institute. It was just held in Frankfurt over the weekend and earlier this week. Jonathan Armstrong was there from Affiliated Monitors. My colleague Eric Feldman was there, and my colleague from Spain, Maria Astigaraga. Eric and Thomas Topolsky presented a session on independent assessments of your compliance and ethics programs, and this was a instance where we had the monitor presenting together with the monitoree. So it was interesting to get a perspective of a live case and see what's happening. A couple things that Maria wanted me to highlight is there was a session on Sapin 2 presented by Marie Lancry, and also Andre Bywater, Jonathan's colleague at Cordery Compliance, stepped in. And basically, they took a look at how Sapin 2 is handling deferred prosecution agreements. And basically, they said that DPAs are something very new, and both prosecutors and lawyers have to learn to collaborate because they are not used to doing this. And that there is also some resistance from judges because they think that a criminal offense must always be condemned. So this is a situation where actually instituting the DPAs lies somewhere in between the model we use here in the U.S., where the judges allow the ruling from the regulator to stand, and the different perspective is if you swing all the way to the UK version of a DPA, where the judge definitely has oversight over the final resolution. And Maria also said there was a very interesting presentation taking a look at millennials and compliance, and millennials want to make an impact in the world. So ethical companies with good compliance programs will have an advantage in millennial retention. In terms of things on the Conversant front, we don't want to appear to be laggards next to the compliance evangelists. So my colleague Eric Feldman is going to be collaborating with Autumn Sinelli over at Conversant, and they're going to be putting on a webinar this coming Wednesday, April 4th, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 11 a.m. Mountain Time. And basically, the headline is that in the past 5 years, more than 200 DPAs and NPAs have been finalized. Companies that demonstrate a corporate commitment to proactive ethics and compliance typically fare better in enforcement actions. Better can mean a civil remedy, lower fines or penalties, and sometimes the best outcome, avoidance of an independent monitor. So we're going to take a look, while you're going to be doing some data-driven things with Conversant, we're going to be looking at basically how you can use proactive monitoring to put your company in a better position should they need to go in front of the regulators.
So Jay, I think that wraps us up. You want to take us home?
Sure. On behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, would like to thank you for joining us for episode 96 of This Week in FCPA, the opening day edition. We hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we look forward to speaking to you next week about all things ethics, compliance, and FCPA.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about the only weekly wrap-up of all things ethics and compliance in the podcast world. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can email Jay at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. Thanks again for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. I hope you'll join us again next week, where we review the week's top compliance and ethics stories. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.